Welcome to True Crime and Tea. We sip the truth and spill the tea behind academic theory in some of these true crime cases. I am your host, Lele, and I actually do have tea with me today because I needed it. The last couple of episodes, I think I was drinking water, but we do actually have tea today. So I'm going to sip my tea. I'm your host, Lele, and today we're diving into one of the most disturbing cases that I have come across. It's one of the most disturbing cases of psychological manipulation to take place. And this all happens on a school campus. This is the case of the Sarah Lawrence cult. I haven't covered cults yet, and I don't know if I want to make a couple of these because they really disturb me and I don't really understand how. I understand how people get trapped in cults, but this case in particular, it makes no sense to me how someone with no academic background manages to weave his way into a university campus, live on campus with university students whilst having a cult on site. Yes. How does a man with no academic background infiltrate an elite liberal arts college, charm some of its brightest students, and turn the dorm into somewhat of a psychological war zone? Today, we'll unpack the trauma, tactics, and the terrifying truth behind Lawrence Larry Ray, and we'll do it all through a somewhat rigorous academic lens. I will caveat this by saying I know I go off on my rants. So I don't quite understand how people like this are allowed to evade the system, because you'll see he evaded the system a little bit. And though we are looking at this through an academic lens, I promise you it's really hard to stay objective on these cases. I try my best. However, this is the opportunity for you to think outside the box, open your mind, put your critical thinking hats on, do a bit of critical analysis, and see how we can draw the academic elements out of this particular case. Sarah Lawrence was a university, and it's known for its academic freedom, critical thinking, and artistic exploration. It's a place where identity is constantly in flux. Here, emerging adults are not only refining their intellectual capabilities, but they're also navigating personal vulnerabilities and doing this whilst being under great academic pressure. So it's a uniquely charged atmosphere which can become, and did become, fertile ground for exploitation. Now enter Larry Ray, who was a manipulative con man with a history of fraud and, as we'll later learn, fabricated claims of intelligence ties. So basically, he said that he had ties to the CIA, but we'll find out more about that later. When Ray moved into his daughter's dorm in 2010, which was a massive red flag, it was a red flag that would soon herald the onset of a chilling power play. Under the guise of therapy and mentoring, he began targeting students at moments where they were open to guidance and vulnerabilities. And in this setting, the lines between genuine support and guidance and exploitation become hauntingly blurred. He manages to infiltrate in a way where he goes in with the hat of support, the hat of mentoring, but it's the perfect amalgamation, the perfect storm for exploitation. From an academic perspective, this context invites us to think about and reflect on educational and developmental psychology, looking at the transitional nature of emerging adulthood and the power dynamics that are inherent in informal mentorship. So not necessarily those structures that are put in place by the institution to support you through your academic journey. These are more those informal mentors that you come across and people that you resonate with. And it gets us to think of how there may be a dynamic shift with those informal relationships. And when we are talking through this process, let's consider how certain systems, which are designed to nurture, to build independence, how they can also render someone extremely vulnerable and open to coercion and coercive control. So Ray's methods were disturbingly systematic. I can't get that word out. Echoed the textbook framework for cultic. Employed tactics such as love bombing, overwhelming his targets with affection and attention, only to follow it through with gaslighting, sleep deprivation, and emotional crisis that eroded their ability to be able to think critically. So they were so infatuated with this man because he was overwhelmingly loving to them. He was giving them all the attention and the affection that they needed. When he's like gaslighting in there, and then he started giving the sleep deprivation and started basically emotionally manipulating them, they were then not able to use their critical thinking abilities to recognize that I think that something's wrong here. There wasn't that functionality, that ability wasn't available to them because of the love bombing that he had done initially. And when we think of Jay Lifton's work when it comes to thought reform, Ray's approach incorporated what Lifton would describe as milieu control. Sounds wrong. Where the environment is tightly regulated to shape a person's perceptions and doctrine over a person, where the collective belief system overrides someone's individual judgment, the person's ability to think for themselves. Because there's an environment that creates a certain perception, creates a certain narrative, they are not able to have that independent objective thought. And then at the same time, a theory of cognitive dissonance, description will be somewhere around here, comes into play when you're faced with conflicting realities where two things can be correct at the same time and one is completely opposed to the other. Victims often tweak their beliefs and their narrative to rationalize their subjugation rather than confront the painful truth that they have been manipulated. So whilst they know what the truth is, because the truth is this is a manipulative situation, this is gaslighting, this is emotional manipulation, because the love bombing has been put in place, they change their belief to think, oh, but he loves me because he's given me all this affection, he's given me all this attention, he's given me the mentorship that I needed. Maybe it's not really gaslighting. And in addition to this, orchestration of power reveals how group psychology, because he didn't just do it to one person, he did a group, a cult is a group of people. So this orchestra of power reveals how group psychology functions in closed systems. The creation of echo chambers, heightened us versus them mentalities, and even the utilization of fear and punishment of enforced conformity. He was not only gaslighting them, he was using things like sleep deprivation as a way to control the masses. And as we reflect on the tactics that he used, you have to ask yourself, would you recognize the tactics he's using as red flags in your own social context, in your own social or academic circle? If someone infiltrated that circle and was using sleep deprivation on its own, you might recognize it. But with the love bombing and everything else on the positive side, so you got the good angel on that shoulder, when you are getting the negative, you're gaslighting, the emotional manipulation, will you be able to recognize that in an academic setting based on everything else that that person is doing? This exploration of coercive control is a cornerstone for both and sociology, particularly when we consider how a nurturing academic environment can paradoxically contribute to vulnerability. When you're mollycoddled, when you're covered in cotton wool, when you're handheld, does that make you more vulnerable to coercive control? And then we can think about how policies in supportive spaces, how they might be re-envisioned to identify and counter such manipulation. So when we do have policy in academia and in college and further education, do these policies help to weed out the red flags of this manipulative behavior, or do they need to be rewritten to refocus and say, right, if this student is in this position, how do we identify that that is a red flag, and how do we support that student? And likewise, how can students recognize that they are being manipulative as well? So what was the legal aftermath, and what institutional reflection happened? So in 2020, Larry's manipulation came to an abrupt halt after his arrest. So he was arrested. It was identified that he was leading a cult, and that he was manipulating these students. He was convicted on 15 counts, including the trafficking, racketeering, and extortion. He was sentenced to 60 years in federal prison. However, this legal resolution is only one piece of the puzzle. Side note, and probably going off on a tangent here, thinking about a couple of the other cases that we've looked at, Miyuki Ishikawa only got 8 years and served for she's Christensen. I can't remember, I don't care what her surname is. She got 20 years, not for unaliving her child, for tampering with a corpse. This dude infiltrates an academic institution, creates a cult, and I know I'm not underplaying what he's done. He's left these students with trauma that they're now going to have to live with for the rest of their lives. That being said, many children's lives were lost in the Miyuki Ishikawa case, and if you want to watch that, that will be one of the next videos you can go and watch. She only got 8 years because they didn't recognize that what she was doing was not mercy unaliving. She was actually taking the lives of innocent young babies, and did not really get punished for that. So just saying, I think that's a bit wild. However, he was to 60 years in federal prison, but the legal resolution is only one piece of the puzzle, because beyond the courtroom, the case forces us to question the institutional responsibilities of institutions like the Sarah Lawrence Lawrence College. How was he even able to live on campus? I know there are many places where you might be in a shared house and there's not really much observation into the types of people that are staying in there, but if you're actually living on campus, which I think he was, how was he able to get away with that? How did no one check that this older man with a conman past had moved in with his daughter on campus? How did an environment renowned for free thought, progressiveness, progressive values, and intellectual inquiry let coercion go on unchecked for over a decade? He was doing this for over 10 years. Here, institutional betrayal theory offers a lens to examine how trusted organizations like colleges and universities can inadvertently enable the very they're meant to prevent. This bridges the discussion on educational policy, leadership, ethics, and safeguarding within the higher education institutes and education institutions, because it also raises compelling questions about how the media's role, as seen in journalism, how that helped to expose this case in particular, in building accountability, how the media's role helped to build the accountability for the institution that allowed this to go on. To further your academic understanding, and you could consider points like applying Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance and Lifton's model of thought reform to analyze Larry Ray's tactics. What role did the unique pressures of college play in control over vulnerable young people, adults? And then you can critically evaluate the safeguarding policies in residential higher education through the lens of the Sarah Lawrence case, thinking about how the institutions balance, foster independence, and ensure safety. How do the institutions make sure that you give those students that are living on campus their freedoms and their independence without treating them like they're children, whilst also keeping them safe from people like Larry Ray. And you could also investigate the role of investigative journalism. If you're interested in journalism and literature and things like that, you can look at the institutional failures, because I'm sorry, the Sarah Lawrence College failed these students, allowing this to go on for over a decade. So you could consider how media scrutiny contributed to justice in this case. 60 years to me is justice. They basically would spend the rest of his life in prison. This happened in 2020. He was a much older man. 60 years, even if he gets his sentence cut to 30 years on good behavior, he's not really going to have much life lived outside of prison if that ever happens. So there was some form of justice in this case compared to other cases that we have looked at. So what do we learn from this dark chapter of the Sarah Lawrence case? Now, it isn't just solely one man's manipulation of a group of young people. It's a very strong reminder of the dangers that can be presented and that are hidden within unchecked power and institutional silence. Where someone has a power over someone else and the institution's technically not doing anything about it, that is an extremely dangerous situation to be in. We've spoken about the dangers of institutional silence in the Miyuki Ishikawa case, and where we alluded to cases like Lucy Letby, where people didn't really expect it to be her, but it was. And then you had the that catapulted the freedom to speak up. That case became, or that freedom to speak up initiative came out of the silence of people within an institution too scared to speak up out of fear of backlash. So what happens in institutions when there is unchecked power and there is a negative impact on a large group of people? In academic spaces built to nurture growth and self-discovery, we must remain extremely vigilant against the subtle shifts that allow coercion to creep in. And as you engage in discussions, write your essays, or even debate in casual hallway discussions and hallway chats, keep challenging the narrative, keep challenging the thoughts. Who truly holds the power? Whose voice is being silenced? And through what mechanisms is that power and is that silence being pushed, being allowed? Harness these academic tools, not just to simply absorb the information, but to pursue it in a deeper truth and to put it into practice. If you ever sense that a trusted mentor or an institution might be blurring these lines, trust your instincts. It might seem like, oh, you're making something out of such a small thing, but many people within this institution may have felt the same way, and it went on for decades because it was unchecked. So if you feel like it's a bit off, trust your gut. Seek out alternative perspectives, because intellectual freedom should empower all of us, not leave us vulnerable to things like emotional manipulation. Thank you for joining me on this episode of True Crime and Tea. This one was a bit more thought-provoking, I think, as opposed to angering. It was very frustrating reading and doing research into the control that this one man had over a group of students, because how did he even get into the institution? I know it was his daughter that was on campus, but it was like, how did he even get into this institution in the first place, and how was he allowed to be there for over 10 years causing havoc? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the psychology of cults, and this cult in particular, and the group dynamics through an academic lens, make sure to subscribe, share, tell a friend, and get your notebook ready for the next episode, where we will be discussing another deep, dark, dangerous, despicable human being. As always, I will see you in the next video. Okay.